All right, there are a few different new Nintendo Switch 2 leak related stories going around online that I want to unpack with you all today, starting with, and probably the most exciting for me, is the conversation around Nintendo Switch 2 backwards compatibility and specifically enhancements for the Switch 1 library of games, aka will your Switch 1 games look and run better on Switch 2 when it's all said and done. And we have one particular leaker putting out how at least third-party companies will be handling this, and just the fact that this is potentially being leaked at all is, I guess, some reassurance that there will be this, what I would consider to be essential feature for such a great library of Switch games that definitely struggled with performance, and that is just them being able to look and run better. So we have to unpack that. Then, if you were somebody who's concerned that the release date for Nintendo Switch 2, amongst all the other leaks and rumors, would just be pushed further out than you maybe thought possible, like late summer and or early fall, we actually have one of the games that a developer teased before Nintendo even revealed the console with a first look trailer, where they said this game will be coming to Nintendo Switch is, with in parentheses ES, meaning multiple models of Switches. They now confirmed the release date of their game, and it's in line with the time frame that I think many of us are hoping to see this console launch, and they're straight up saying it's launching on Switches on this launch date, so you can maybe use this as a gauge for the console won't come out any later than this particular date. And lastly, I just want to look at some brand new CAD rendering files that have popped up online that do reveal exactly what the Switch 2 Joy-Con grip look like, and it's what a Joy-Con grip, how you'd expect it to look, but of course with one major new feature, and that's likely how the Joy-Cons attached to it. But we're going to get on the same page with all of these details. Before we do, make sure you like, subscribe, and turn on your bell notification to join Sunbro Nation if you're new here. And I want to first kick it off by hopping over to X, where user Nash Weedle, who you might be familiar with, I'm not 100% sold on their track record by any stretch of the imagination, but they have gotten some very hard to predict things right. Metroid Dread, the title, and the release timing of the game, Mario and Luigi Brothership, which actually happened right around the time that that game was revealed to us, and they called it before anybody else was saying anything about it online. So they have some hard to guess stuff that gives them a little bit of credibility. They also put a lot of stuff out there, so I'm not taking this entirely to be as 100% fact, but this part I do think makes a lot of sense for us to see on Switch 2 either way. And you can see this post from them on X, which reads, Leak Express, there were doubts about how Switch game upgrades would arrive on Switch 2, as it seems that each company will decide. You will have to pay for Dragon Ball Kakarot, while No Man's Sky will be free. What will happen to Nintendo's own games? So according to their own information at face value, they are saying this will be handled on a game-by-game basis, aka it's up to the developers and publishers, and that probably goes for whether or not any games get updates to begin with, because you take games like No Man's Sky and Dragon Ball Kakarot, which he specifically named in this leak, and those are ongoing games. I mean, Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, I think, just got a brand new version announced for it that will be sold digitally, tied into the new anime and things. So that's going to be a continually updated game that I think makes sense to be in this conversation. You have No Man's Sky. I think a lot of their updates are free, and it would make sense for them to continue to update that game and make it run and look better on Nintendo Switch. He's saying at no cost, meaning if you own No Man's Sky, the Switch version, it should just run better as part of this free software upgrade that the developer is providing. Of course, assuming that this leak is indeed accurate. But this does paint an interesting picture for what this could look like, because I think there's a lot of third-party and first-party, even Nintendo Switch pieces of software that would not only benefit from this, but also be in the conversation to have some kind of better playable version on Switch 2. And it's interesting because we don't know how Nintendo's going to do this, and the leak doesn't really reveal how they would handle upgrades either. And I also think it's going to be on a hand-picked game-by-game basis, and it's not going to be like an across-the-board everything runs and looks better. But we have these internal code names like U-King-O, which is heavily believed to be a remastered version of Breath of the Wild, and we even saw this talked about before we learned about the code name for this game, back as far as Gamescom 2023, when it was claimed that developers were being shown on targeted spec PC hardware a 4K 60 version of Breath of the Wild with no load times. And so a remaster like that from Nintendo, which is substantial and may even get a standalone retail box Switch 2 version re-release for $70 with the DLC included and everything. How will they handle that? Will they go the Sony route and essentially a recently remastered game that's still playable on their hardware via backwards compatibility? Do we get the option just to pay $10 to get that upgrade added into our library and it changes the whole game and upgrades everything? Or do they go the very anti-consumer route and say, no, you have to buy the new version, that's the only way you can play it? I don't suspect that from Nintendo, because of the fact that there is a large library of Switch games, and I don't think they're just going to be porting and remastering all of these all over again. I think they're going to give us an upgrade path, and I actually think it could tie into the NSO conversation when we talk about that service potentially having a price hike around the corner with something like GameCube games getting added in, which it seems like those are on the way. I have a separate video in the channel deep diving that if you haven't looked into it. But when we see that kind of price increase, we might also need more value, and a perfect way you could add value to that service is, hey, the premium tier NSO subscribers get all of the Switch game upgrades for no additional cost, and it's something that it kind of replaces the DLC edition that we saw them do with the expansion pack and things like that. So that way Breath of the Wild gets a 4K version and you don't have to spend anything. You're a premium tier Nintendo Switch Online subscriber. Something like that could be on the cards, or Nintendo could just do these patches and not charge for them, but the precedent's kind of been set. Nintendo tends to charge amongst the top of any game company out there, and Sony, they like to do this with things like Last of Us Part 1 and 2, the Horizon Zero Dawn, their recent remasters that get basically a way better version for PS5, and they get a standalone release again, but you have the option to get that upgraded version for just $10. I'm hoping Nintendo sticks to that $10 price point. It could be 10, 15, 20, who knows, but it does sound like it's not going to be an across the board, just everything automatically runs better on Switch 2, because it really doesn't work like that unless, I mean, I suppose if there's an unlocked frame rate in a game, I imagine it could take advantage of the newer hardware, but you might have to tell it to do that first. So some kind of patch, some kind of developer work has to be done for these games to be able to register the new horsepower, from my understanding. And I do think that some games this makes sense for and will get that treatment, especially ones that are ongoing with new content and are continuing to evolve. But there's going to be a whole host of Nintendo Switch games that we're waiting for that performance patch. We want the performance patch and it just never comes. Probably Pokemon Scarlet and Violet will run just the same as they do on the current Switch, and they'll probably run exactly the same on the next gen Switch, unfortunately. But obviously the more game upgrades the better, and this is a reassuring story for me to see, just a new source basically putting out there that game upgrades will be handled on some level, and it's going to be up to the developer and publisher on if they charge for that stuff or not. But from there, I want to shift the conversation over to the release date, or the supposed release date of Nintendo Switch 2, or at least the general release time, because if you need some more reassurance that maybe, you know, these May 15th dates that have been thrown out there, if you're not sold on that, or you're not sold on a June launch, well, there is yet another piece of very good looking information, let's say, that suggests that this console is indeed headed to be a early summer release and not something like a late summer or fall release. You might remember a little game called Robbie in the Riverside that got a lot of coverage online because it was just straight up advertising that it was coming to PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S, and Nintendo Switch is, and the ES was in parentheses, clearly teasing that they're talking about multiple model Switches here, not just the current lineup of Switch family of systems we have today. And of course, this was all happening before the first look trailer for Nintendo Switch 2 hardware, and now we have an update for that game, which is its release date. As you can see, this following post, which outlines Robbie in the Riverside, will be coming to PlayStation 5, Xbox One, and Series X and S, and Nintendo Switches on June 26, 2025. Now, you could play devil's advocate and say that there's no way the company knows that Nintendo is releasing their console then, but they're just confidently stating, the same way they did that it was coming to Nintendo's next gen hardware before it was announced, they're just saying it's coming out for the Switches, and it's going to be out on June 26, 2025. So while I wouldn't say that this is a definitive release date for Nintendo Switch 2 or anything like that, and it's not like it has to happen, like it could have the Switch 1 version launch on the 26th and then the Switch 2 version comes out later on. And interestingly enough, that 26th date is actually a Thursday, which is when Nintendo publishes their first party piece of software. I don't think they necessarily for 100% certain know the release date of Nintendo Switch 2, but they probably have a loose idea, and them just confidently saying it will be out on the Switches on the 26th. It's yet another good sign that we're not going to have to wait past the month of June to have this console playable in our hands. And of course, we have to wait till April 2nd to get confirmation of that. But between all the different other leaks and tidbits of information that are pointing to dates like May 15th with, you know, the Mario Kart Lego set, we think Mario Kart is going to be a new launch game for Switch 2. Then, of course, we have Doom the Dark Ages, a Microsoft published game coming out on a Thursday, which is when Nintendo releases their games, and it might be a launch game for Switch 2. And interestingly, Nintendo opening up their San Francisco store location on the 15th. I still like May 15th. It might not be the day, it might, but nonetheless, another piece of information to kind of line into that May-June timeframe at the latest. So the only other last thing I want to touch on very briefly is just some brand new looks at the CAD rendering files for the Nintendo Switch 2 Joy-Con grip. And while there's not a whole lot here that you wouldn't just expect to see, it looks literally like a Joy-Con grip. You can see from the side profile image of it that yes, it does look like it's of course going to have that magnetic attachment from the side, as you would expect it to, not with something like this, the rail system that was on the original Switch Joy-Con grip, but maybe a little bit more ergonomic, nothing game changing or groundbreaking here, but a new piece of Nintendo Switch 2 hardware that will come in the box that we probably won't even get a look at this. Well, I guess we might get a look at this in the Nintendo Switch 2 Direct via some rendering or some trailer that they show, but you know, it's just an early look before Nintendo officially reveals it. And I'm sure at this point, with all of the different CAD renderings we've seen check out, that this one, as it was reported from Necro Felipe, and I think originally to FWD BWD, who is a Fami Boards user who's leaked stuff like this in the past, this is probably going to check out and look exactly like this when we get it. But you know, for me personally, I'm going to be picking up the Pro Controller ASAP as soon as we get the announcement of that and the pre-order dates and all that stuff. So it probably won't get used very much by me, at least, just like my current Joy-Con grip really doesn't get used that much by me. But let me know in the comments down below what you make of all the different stories. Are you excited to see further sources suggesting that upgraded backwards compatibility will be a thing and that it will be individually priced from the game developers and publishers? And do you think Nintendo handles this any differently than that? Do you think there's a world where they're charging 10, 15 bucks for something like a Breath of the Wild upgrade? Do you think that maybe the upgraded games are actually very few and far between and they're not that across the board? Or do you think Nintendo goes back and actually gives us those performance patches for a number of different first-party content? I'm hoping Echoes of Wisdom gets ones at some point before I replay that game again. It had some noticeable frame dips in the overworld. You know, you'd like to see stuff like that cleaned up, but how widespread do you think Nintendo will go? And would you be happy to pay for game performance upgrades, something like 10, 20 bucks, or have it thrown into NSO? Or do you think that this is something that should be included just for having the new console? And what do you think about June 26th as a potential console release date? Do you think that is actually the date since it happens to be on a Thursday? Or do you think that this is just signifying that, yeah, we're not looking at a late summer or early fall type launch for this console? And if you had to pick any of the rumored dates between May 15th and afterwards, what would you personally go with? So make sure you share all your thoughts and feelings in the comments down below before you leave, regardless if we agree or disagree. Also, make sure you like, subscribe, turn your notification bell. And with that, I've been Sunbro, you've been Nation. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.